Okay. Um, so yeah, my name is Jesse Tarrant with Yellowstone-Teton Clean Cities. We've been trying to do a monthly renewable diesel working group. It's been almost 3 years now. I think they weren't monthly back then, but I have some dating back to 2023. I took the last 2 months off because we haven't had any funding specifically for this project, so we're focusing on stuff that we do have funding for. But I reached out to some fuel distributors, fuel producers, consumers, and just blatantly asked, "Can you give us money so we can keep doing this?" And so far, Montana Renewables has stepped up. They've sponsored us. It should cover really almost the whole year, specifically for this talk. But I'm still asking some entities for some funding specifically for this project because I think that the demand continues. I get questions every week about this. Somebody will sign up every other week, it seems, and I don't promote it. So people are spreading the word, and people are still interested. Um, One thing I'll mention before we start is that we've been working for the last year and a half, maybe, to become designated a Montana Clean Cities. Right now, we're Yellowstone-Teton Clean Cities, and we work with the Gateway. We started off with the Gateway communities to Yellowstone National Park, but we ended up covering most of Montana and Wyoming and eastern Idaho. But we applied for apprentice coalition status, and we were granted that. So pretty soon we'll have our apprentice coalition webpage up on the Department of Energy's Clean Cities and Communities page. Um, so that's kind of a cool new happening for us. So today's guests are from the East Coast. They also did a renewable diesel working group, a quarterly one. I'm not sure. Did you guys do your last one yet, or is that still upcoming?
Next month,
Yeah.
couple
Next
weeks.
Yeah.
next
Mhm.
Yeah.
month will be the last one of their four quarterly renewable diesel working groups. So we have John Gagne, he's the co-director of Maine Clean Communities, and then we have Peggy O'Neill Vivanco, she's the director of Vermont Clean Cities. And they teamed up to do this renewable diesel working group on the East Coast. Um, who was anybody from New Hampshire participating? Is there Clean Cities there?
Yeah, Granite State Clean Cities, they had coalition director transition, and Jessica Wilcox is the interim director. She's been the director before, so she's just having light touches. But I think some of the initial conversations we had about renewable diesel in our region came from New Hampshire.
So yeah, a cool collaboration up there. I guess the geography, while diverse, is geographically not as large as we have in Montana. So it's nice that they can collaborate so closely. And one of the cool things that they'll probably talk about is Massport. I guess it's a pilot study, but it's maybe more than that now, using it in all their snow removal equipment. That's what I had on that little announcement I sent out yesterday. I think that really applies to our region, all the snow removal equipment, and how well it works for airports. I'm going to give maybe 5 slides of background just for everybody to get caught up, and then we'll let our guests talk. So the typical slide I show almost every time is, and I think I'm needing less and less to do this, but what I always start off with is, what is renewable diesel? It's not biodiesel. While it's chemically, uh, it's very similar to petroleum diesel. It's just a lot cleaner. You can blend it with petroleum diesel in any amount, any fraction you want. You don't have to change any fueling equipment or any vehicle specs or anything. It meets all the same ASTM standards as petroleum diesel does. And again, it can be used in all diesel equipment and vehicles. So heaters, generators, anything. In our region here, we have 4 refineries. We have Montana Renewables in Great Falls. We have Marathon in Dickinson. And then we have Holly Frontier Sinclair. They have 2 locations in Wyoming. So we produce quite a bit of renewable on a national scale. I think a couple of years ago it was about
See ya.
20%
Have
of
a good night.
about 25% of the country's renewable fuel came from our region. Uh, This slide I usually just use to explain that the production of renewable diesel occurs in the same way that petroleum refining occurs, and oftentimes it's the same plant or a converted refinery. In Great Falls, they do about 50-50 renewable and petroleum-based refining. They're focusing a lot on sustainable aviation fuel, and last year had a one were awarded a $1.5 billion expansion grant to do more SAF production. Um, maybe five more slides here, but chemically, this has always been a good way to illustrate the differences. Petroleum diesel is a complex mixture of hydrocarbons ranging from carbon lengths of 8 carbons to 25, lots of paraffins, aromatics, sulfurs, and other impurities. There's some metals in there too. Um, Maybe 75% of that is these linear hydrocarbons, and the rest are these cyclics and metal containing and sulfur containing molecules. On the other hand, renewable diesel is a small subset of these, a very narrow range of hydrocarbon chains. And that's illustrated here. So when you burn a complex mixture, you're going to get a complex mixture of um, combustion products, and that's kind of what you see here. When you burn it, you get a lot of soot, whereas when you burn renewable diesel, it's a lot cleaner. And this plays into why one of the reasons why it's so much better for even new vehicles, because the emission systems don't have to work as hard to clean up all of that soot because it isn't there. All the issues that fleets have with diesel particulate filters and having to regen them and all the associated issues and time downtime kind of goes away with renewable diesel. So, I mean, I could talk for hours about it, but will leave it there, and we can ask questions at the end. But so I'll let our two guest presenters tell us what's happening on the East Coast.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. We'll go ahead. Oh, here. I just requested to share. Okay, we're good. Okay. Oops. Are we looking at the right version?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Never know with two screens. So yeah, thanks Jesse for the invite. This is, I think we've definitely joined this working group a couple times. And actually this is the whole reason how we got started with this work on the East Coast. I think there were a couple ski mountains that have been joining this working group session that have been part of it probably since 2023 when this group first started forming and having these conversations. And of course, some of the ski mountains that are owned on the West Coast and Intermountain West are also owned on the East Coast. So we actually had a few ski mountains start this conversation for us, and it's been a quite a journey learning all about this fuel. Peggy and I are both in ZEV states, so really focused on electrification and full decarbonization through that technology. So this has been kind of new for us. But like Jesse mentioned, my name is John Gagne, also joined by Peggy O'Neill Pavanko from both Maine and Vermont Clean Communities. So a little bit of context and background on our Northeast Working Group. Like I had mentioned, some of the ski mountains had reached out to us back in 2023, right around the time that this working group and the Yellowstone-Teton area was really starting to pick up. And, they had reached out to us saying, hey, some of our mountains on the West Coast are starting to use renewable diesel. How can we get that fuel to our Northeast markets? I think originally it was called HVO, which is what it's typically referred to in European countries and some other parts of the world. And we had no idea what that was. So that started us down a rabbit hole. And then all of a sudden, New York City comes out later in the year, announces that they're fully transitioning their fleet to renewable diesel, which is a really big deal. They have over 12,000 vehicles in their fleet, and that was a total diesel consumption of over 16 million gallons. So having a commitment at that scale on the East Coast was pretty monumental for just putting renewable diesel on the map for us and also having some sort of large entity bringing interest to our region. And then in September, almost a year later, after we really started having some conversations, started to sort of pull the veil back a little bit on this work. We hosted a webinar, which was really well attended and sort of brought us to where we are now. And we ended up getting some funding from one of the national labs to be convening a quarterly working group, really looking to establish this new renewable diesel market in the Northeast that, to our knowledge, maybe had been talked about here and there, but all of a sudden it seemed like it was popping up out of nowhere for us. So really trying to ride that wave. So we, formulated 4 sessions: renewable diesel introduction, because this was a completely new fuel to a lot of folks. We had some experience with biodiesel, but never renewable diesel. We wanted to cover logistics and, some of those like basic things like Jesse had mentioned earlier, chemically identical to petroleum diesel, using your fueling equipment that you already have and the vehicles that you already have, which is very different from a lot of folks that are looking at a zero emission transition, which includes significant capital investments. So this was a really big opportunity that we wanted to jump on. In our last session, we had talked about some policy actions that we could take and even opened the floodgates to looking at the thermal sector to really expand renewable diesel. Similar to Jesse's slide that he has for every session, we have this slide that we've been including as well. And we really emphasize this because New England has been using biodiesel or has had some experience with biodiesel probably over the last decade. And when biodiesel was sort of in that infancy phase in the Northeast, we had some challenges with cold weather properties, and so that had tainted the biofuels market. And so we really wanted to like emphasize that these are not the same fuels, really sort of emphasizing that chemical identical, and meeting the same ASTM specs as petroleum diesel. We also really wanted to emphasize sort of that we're looking at the carbon intensity of the fuel, not just emissions or tailpipe emissions. And then looking at this idea of biogenic emissions, which can be a different classification for renewable or bio-based fuels. So just to give you all sort of like a context or like a snapshot of what the public fueling infrastructure looks like right now. West Coast looks great. California specifically, Oregon, states that have a low carbon fuel standard that's really helped amplify the fuel production and bring the fuel to market. And then, in the mountains, there's definitely some that are popping up here and there. If you look at the East Coast, it looks nothing like that. It's almost completely barren except for some facilities down in New York, and the port of New Jersey. However, that hasn't stopped folks from starting to look at pilots. And so we've got a couple pilots on our radar, some pilots that we have been following, that have either stopped or transitioned into full-scale deployment. So some of them that we looked at where Burlington Electric is doing some use cases in their peaker plants for on-site energy generation, which is really interesting. The University of Albany, as part of the SUNY system, has been looking at expanding renewable diesel in their university systems. The MBTA and we've got a colleague here on the call, that's been really instrumental in getting a pilot up and running with the Massachusetts Transit Authority. And so looking at integrating renewable diesel into the commuter rail system, which is really cool. And then Yale was using renewable diesel at one point, and they ended up stopping due to some supply challenges. But if we can sort of bridge the gaps in those distribution networks, hopefully they can move back to that process. And then the really big one is Massachusetts Port Authority, which we'll be talking about today. They had just wrapped up a pilot and have sort of moved on to full-scale deployment. And yeah, like our big messaging is that, as we're having these conversations with folks, like renewable diesel in the Northeast is growing. 2 years ago, we didn't know what renewable diesel was, and all of a sudden, like everyone's talking about it. And it could be, the federal shift, moving slightly away from electric vehicles and a lot of capital expenses from that to this more drop-in fuel model, which is a much lower barrier for folks, as long as we can get the fuel to the region and make it at least somewhat price competitive to petroleum counterparts. And so, the big thing that kicked it off for us was this big announcement. And I think this big announcement has helped, instill confidence for other agencies and other fleets around the region in New England to really look at like this wide scale adoption of renewable diesel. And so seeing that New York City's got about 60 million gallons of diesel on an annual basis, and then making that commitment to fully transition. And actually, they have now fully transitioned their entire fleet to renewable diesel. That's turned a lot of heads. And like I said, there's over 12,000 vehicles in the fleet. So definitely not a small fleet and quite a big emissions reduction savings. And the fuel for that right now is being supplied by Sprague and approved oil. So now we'll move into covering some of the other pilots that have been happening in our region. We'll have some time after if folks have questions. We actually did a site visit to some of these pilot locations, so can talk more about some of the things that we saw and heard. But with that, I will pass it over to Peggy.
Great. Yeah, thanks, folks. And thanks, Jesse. Again, Jesse was a big inspiration for us to take on the renewable diesel working group in the Northeast, or New England. I mean, no geography test here, but we are northern New England, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and probably like some folks in Montana and Wyoming, your climates are significantly different than even states just slightly south of yours, and that's one of the challenges that we've had in trying to find like a viable alternative fuel that works in really cold climates. I am right. Our states both border Canada. We get cold like you folks out west. And even looking at, 16 million gallons in New York City, folks in Vermont and Maine are like, Pah, New York City, it's a different climate. So we really needed to see, gosh, is there anything in New England that's been piloting this? So when our colleague from Massachusetts Clean City said, hey, Massport, which runs Logan Airport, is piloting renewable diesel, we got on the phone with them and, super, super small world in New England. I had worked with one of the folks there when he was in Vermont, and we connected, heard more about their pilot. So what's interesting, and I think, folks who are trying to run mission critical machinery can't have it. None of us can have our vehicles down. They said, they went into this pilot, tentative. They didn't want to. They just were using it at first on like an old snowplow that they said, wow, this worked better than it ever has, and then started running it in other machines. So even after they were kind of like tiptoed through it and were tentative and then moved on, and then they were fully committed, and our partners at Massport said, now everyone should do it. So it's really interesting how, when we work with fleets, it's really making sure that they're comfortable with this fuel. Massport just signed a contract with Brocco Energy in Massachusetts for 1.2 million gallons of renewable diesel. They have net zero goals. So anything that can be electrified, they're working on that electrification. But there are many vehicles that can't, as we all know. John, the next slide. And so the big snow plows that plow the airfield, that's one of the runway machines. Their trucks, they even use it on some of their buses. They have some buses that are electric and other they just use on renewable diesel. And some of the ground equipment, they're transitioning to renewable diesel and eventually will electrify. So it is definitely an integral part of their climate plans. When we went to real quickly, when we went on the site visit to Massport, if you haven't been behind the scenes at an airport, it's like super high security. And John and I were like in the Uber, like, wow, you know what's going to happen? We're just going to see big yellow vehicles. Like there's nothing different. And that was the great thing. There was really nothing different. Like these machines are moving around, they're working, they're functioning. I will say the one thing that we did notice is standing in that garage for an hour, you don't get a headache. You don't get that diesel headache. So that was probably the big difference. Otherwise, like everything's moving around just like it would in regular diesel. So that was exciting. Next slide. So this is from Massport. They were trying to use A Fleet and GREET, which are tools from Department of Energy, on how to kind of how to analyze the different feedstocks to see what the kind of reduced emissions would be. I mean, I'm not going to go into like all the details here. Some of the fuel, it's I think Nesty is probably the gold standard, and I think we heard that from maybe one of your webinars, working groups, Jesse, and also from Boyne Mountain when they were presenting. Um, so I think evaluating, having a third party be able to evaluate the different feedstocks to look at the tailpipe emission, I think is really important, and will be important going forward as we get to the point in Maine and Vermont to look at pilots and how to evaluate those. But you'll see that with the soy feedstock, they noted a 65% less fewer life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, and reduction in SOx as well. Massport had, for their pilot, they had a designated tank. It was a small tank. I forget how many gallons they used, but it was a just discrete tank that they were going to use just for some of their vehicles before they expanded it to the rest of their airport. After they went through the pilot, they said they they could just use any tank, which is what they are using now. So they didn't have to transition to new fueling infrastructure again, as John mentioned, as we all know, those keep costs down so that you're not increasing any capital expenses and investing in a kind of different fueling infrastructure. Next slide. Here are just some examples of the areas. So Massport runs Logan Airport, Hanscom Field. They're bringing Worcester Airport online as well. They're using yard tractors in the ports. They're street sweepers and they're snow melters. So the snow melters was their really big test. And when they were first doing the pilot, they didn't have enough snow, and this was on our webinar. So they didn't have enough snow at Logan, so they had their fuel provider drive up to Nova Scotia to test the fuel. That's a committed fuel provider, to be able to see how the snow melter would work with the snow because of the lack of snow. And then of course they got snow in Boston. Anyway, next slide. They did their due diligence, making sure they spoke with OEMs that they weren't going to void any warranties, which is, we've heard, it's a drop in fuel and you won't avoid any warranties. And they worked with a bunch of suppliers and distributors to test the cold weather properties and ensure that what they had was going to serve them, especially in the cold months. Next slide. As I mentioned, they are working towards zero emission on their ground equipment, and their goal is ZEV vehicles by 2031. So some of the smaller vehicles will move to electric, but renewable diesel is definitely into this pathway. Next slide. All right, I'm sure Joe Natale is on this call ready to jump in and correct me if I'm making mistakes here. So Joe is from Renstar, and Renstar and MBTA, so that is the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority, and so they run a lot of the commuter rail service in the greater Massachusetts, Boston area. So there's a pilot going on with renewable diesel in the MBTA locomotives. And this is the first one. Renstar is providing them with the fuel. Um, and sorry, can you hear me? I'm just
Yeah, you're good.
okay. Okay, sorry, my internet keeps kind of glitching here. So as of now, there are over 500,000 gallons of RD that have been delivered to the MBTA, and they haven't had any performance issues. Joe, if you have anything to add on that, let me know. But they are moving forward on this pilot, and working within the rail yards. Renstar has mobile fueling, so it will make it easier to fuel the locomotives. Um, I think. Oh, thanks, John. Um, we get a lot of a lot of our fuel on the East Coast from the Gulf Coast, from Louisiana in particular. So that tie-in from the shipments up from Louisiana right to the rail line is super convenient. And certainly, as we look at the pilots in Vermont and New Hampshire, which are north of Massachusetts, looking at rail line connections are also going to be vital fuel lines. The longer term project is to move towards fully transitioning renewable diesel across the MBTA operations, um, doing the carbon tracking and reporting. Again, for a lot of our fleets, they haven't tracked um, some things like their maintenance. So once we do a pilot, they don't even know what fuel savings they have, what maintenance savings. So as we look to pilots, it's important to have an opportunity for the fleets to capture some data before the pilot starts, so we're able to fully compare these cost, fuel, and emission savings. Next slide. Another in our general area in the Northeast, SUNY Albany. So SUNY is the State University of New York system. So there are universities across the state from Long Island all the way out to Buffalo. Albany is the capital, and it's kind of along the border of Massachusetts, south of Vermont. SUNY Albany decided to kind of implement renewable diesel as part of the strategy in their climate action plan. And Sprague Energy has a terminal in Rensselaer, which is right near Albany. So that made where they have renewable diesel. So that made this transition super easy for them. They're running buses, heavy duty vehicles, diesel mowers. And again, they're electrifying where they can, and where the heavy duty vehicles are not viable, they're using renewable diesel. So goals are lower emissions, moving away from fossil fuels, air quality, and supporting their climate goals. And so far, this started just this past year. They haven't had any performance issues. Um, it is, but we've heard from other fleets who've done some piloting that sometimes the sustainability folks and the managers don't even let the operation staff, don't let them all know about the renewable diesel transition, because they really want folks to be able to say, like, there's something wrong, or not have a bias if something goes on with a vehicle, and blame it on the alternative fuel. Again, in the Northeast, several fleets were kind of burned by some biodiesel issues, and they're hoping to have a kind of a cleaner transition with renewable diesel. Next slide.
Yeah, and the one pilot that we're missing here that I mentioned on that map slide was the one by Burlington Electric. And
Oh,
be adding that, as we get more information and as more information comes out about that pilot. But that's like a totally different use case, not necessarily in transportation, but in their peaker plants. So when you need that sort of immediate extra power generation or electricity generation. It's kind of a unique use case for the fuel. And one of the big topics that I mentioned earlier that we had talked about in our last working group session was really like opening the floodgates to the thermal sector. And is there opportunities to start using this for home heating oil, or some other use cases that can help boost up our demand? Maine and Vermont have not a lot of people and definitely not a lot of density, which can make, bringing this new fuel to market kind of challenging. And so one of the big things that we've been working on is trying to identify like these big anchor fleets that have large annual consumption, that can sort of justify a steady supply to either of our states. We do have some terminals already in our states that in theory could have renewable diesel, if we had the customer base for it. We've got some right in Portland and South Portland, that come in by ship. So there are opportunities. We're still trying to find that sweet spot of demand versus supply, and start to have some of these conversations. And so, we're sort of moving towards this larger scale group procurement process. We've been having a lot of these conversations with of the benefits. Some of the challenges are still, cold climate modifications. We can still get cold snaps here in northern New England, which is something we have to be conscious of. I think this group procurement and fueling, for fueling and price is probably going to be our golden ticket if we can figure figure that out. We do group procurement, for a lot of municipalities in our area as an RPO and an MPO, whether that's road salt or various other fuels. So it's not totally out of our realm, but really trying to understand what that process could look like and how many folks would sort of be interested. So both Peggy and I have been having conversations with, some local stakeholders, talking to transit agencies, municipalities, ski mountains. I've even had a meeting with our airport, right in Portland, Maine here. So there's a lot of interest. And I think, like I said, people have been looking to these pilots to see how they've been running. And the biggest thing we keep hearing from Massport is it's great. Like it works. It really is a drop in fuel. It's like, you can say this as many times as you want, but until people sort of see it in action and, can sort of get that confirmation, that's sort of what builds the confidence. And then a lot of these like peer-to-peer exchanges. So, we're trying to sort of continue to bridge the gaps and really position renewable diesel in our markets for, both a bridge fuel for folks that are considering electrification or moving in that direction, or maybe some of our municipalities or, fleets that want to do something, but electrification might not be the right fit for them. So trying to get creative with how we approach this work in the Northeast.
All
But
right.
yeah, that's sort of what we got. And if there's any questions, happy to answer, or at least redirect
Yeah,
folks.
that was great to hear that how quickly things have progressed there. Maybe it was happening the whole time just under the radar, but just like New York City's huge adoption and all these things just happening so quickly, it seems once that happens, it should be a lot easier following it. I think it continues to be an uphill battle here a little bit, but because we don't have those huge examples locally. Steve Parker on the call here has been they've been using it at Jackson Hole Mountain Resort for years, but um, that helped maybe Big Sky Resort do it, but no big cities yet. There are talks. I got a text while we were on this call from Sunoco just bought Parkland Fuels, who has been helping us in our region, and he just told me that he's working on how to acquire fuel from Montana to keep it in Montana, and so things are happening here too, and it was great to see. But yeah, let's open it up to any questions. Anybody have any questions? So Susan's got one here in the chat. Yeah, what's the current price difference? What I've always said has been about $1 a gallon, but it really varies anywhere from 25 cents a gallon premium to maybe $1.50. But what are you guys seeing over there right now?
We're seeing about $1, and w- um, Joe Natale from Renstar on our last call was helping us think through an RFP when we move forward with the pilot. And Joe, you can jump in a second here, because when we look at those costs, it's also the shipping costs and the trucking costs. So making sure that you're really looking kind of the actual fuel and not all the add-ons, which can of course add on the farther afield you are, as we are in Burlington. Joe, do you want to? Can I just have Joe add anything if you're
Yeah, sure.
okay?
So great. The entire discussion point has been spot on, and I smiled because it's basically everything that we were going through during the RFP process with the MBTA. From, hey, we're just going to give you a couple locomotives to work on because we know you're going to screw this up with this new chemical, RD, and a couple weeks in, we were fueling every locomotive in the state. So it just put a smile on my face. But from a price perspective, I'm hearing these numbers of $1. What the general consensus is and the mindset of the purchasers are, oh, it's expensive. I've heard this time and time again, and they compare it to a California or a West Coast basis. Well, that stuff is heavily incentivized, and the producers, marketers, traders capture every piece of that incentive, and that's what makes it so expensive. Now, I honestly think our entire industry and everyone on this call has some leverage because those incentives are slowly starting to narrow, and there's various incentives in various states where these producers want to participate, i.e., I think I heard Sprague mentioned that molecule is actually produced down in the Gulf Coast, if I'm not mistaken, and it's brought up on a barge. So my point is being cleaning up the supply chain. You're going from a production in the Gulf Coast onto a ship or a barge, because Jones Act ships are very expensive if they're even available for this commodity. A barge coming up the coast, back into another tank, then into a truck to be delivered. Needless to say, I'm pretty sure all those pieces of equipment probably aren't using RD. But it's, again, and I'm very bullish on this, is these originations also have rail. So if it's a rail direct play and your destination has rail in close proximity, you're cleaning up a lot of the supply chain. And the railroads, yeah, are they expensive on freight because they have their posted tariffs? But if there's a discussion on a commodity that they're not presently hauling and they're competing against a water move, they clean up and sharpen their pencils to be very close to what a marine move would look like. And then when you take the rail car into your yard, you don't have to worry about potentially demurrage on a vessel that can't offload or lay time delays at the port. We don't have that on the rail side. Once the car is delivered into your yard, it is your custody at this point, and any demurrage charges are ceased. Those charges are baked into your cost of supply when a marine molecule is brought. So it's a lot of homework on the supply chain because the cost basis is all the same. It's just how you get it there.
I have there's another question in the chat. What I mention often is that premium, and we've done this analysis for Idaho National Lab. Dollar premium actually pays for itself in the reduced maintenance for new vehicles. Even at $1 a gallon, it was paying for Idaho National Lab. So depending on what your maintenance costs are and what your downtime is valued at, this premium can be more than saved. I'll mention that all the fuel produced by Montana Renewables here in Montana goes out by rail. And that's one of the reasons it's been harder for us to get it because they don't have a truck terminal. It's just a rail terminal. So we have to try and find a purchaser of a full rail car. And so that's caused some problem.
Jesse, do
Yeah,
you what kind of heating do you? I'm sure it's multiple sources. Do you guys use home heating oil?
I don't think heating oil is very common in Montana or Wyoming. We have a lot of natural gas, electric,
Yeah. Hmm.
um, I think, and propane. Not a lot of heating oil compared to like the East Coast. I mean, this fuel definitely could work for that. I just think the heating oil is such a lower quality product and probably a lot cheaper. So there's got to be some way to, uh, I don't know, the product's a lot more valuable, not for heating, but
Mm.
definitely could be used.
I was wondering if you can comment a little bit more on advice for running pilots. You had talked a little bit about having this discrete tank and kind of picking certain vehicles and, acknowledging that we don't have 12,000 vehicles in any of our fleets. People might have a dozen, they might have 100, but probably closer in that range. But how many vehicles would you use in a pilot for how long or how many different seasons? What types of things would you measure while you're doing that? And are you doing your pilots with R99? Are you doing them with like a lower blend? I'm interested in some of those details.
So, Tanya, stay tuned and join us on our February 4th webinar because we are asking those questions. So, um, Vermont, I mean, we have 600 and we have more people than Wyoming, but not by much, right? So no, like when we look at stuff in Massachusetts, I'm like, that's like one town is bigger than our whole state. So, for us, so I have several fleets, a transit fleet, a university fleet, a municipality. I've got a skier. I actually have 5 fleets that are really interested in the pilot. And with a heavy duty fleet, they have a designated tank. I don't know. I'm just making it up. Like maybe it's 10,000 gallons, and they haul some refrigerated dairy products. So they thought like, oh, that would be great for those vehicles that fuel up at that site, and this would be, a handful, 5. So I think it's going to vary depending on the fleet. I mean, we're probably a lot more similar than comparing us to Massachusetts or New York. As far as seasons, for us, we really feel that it's super valuable to do like a 12-month pilot. We need to go through a winter, and we have shoulder seasons. I don't know what you call it, West, right? Where all of a sudden, it's or the January thaw where it's 40 degrees right now, and it's going to be 10 tomorrow. So you can't be changing out, like this is where biodiesel, like you just have to kind of back to regular diesel in the winter. So understanding those seasonalities and those changes in temperature, which I think in kind of more recent years have been pretty extreme. So size, tank, um,
Blend
gear.
R99, R50, R.
That's gonna, I think, depend on the the fleets. And I probably say in the winter, they probably wouldn't go a full R99 just just for kind of anxiety reasons and looking at, okay, well, what did Massport use? And how to adjust it so that you have vehicles running and the transit buses are able to run. So we don't know yet. Those are all the questions that we're going to be asking our stakeholder group in February. John, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I remember some of the folks in the Pacific Northwest starting with an R50 blend and then gradually increasing to R99 once they felt comfortable with that. And yeah, like we were talking to Massport. They started with one vehicle, and it was like an old vehicle, one that they honestly could care less if something were to have gone wrong. Thankfully, nothing did go wrong, and so once they saw success there, they really wanted to like limit test the fuel and sort of operated it in the dead of winter, doing the critical snow melting on the runways for Boston Logan Airport. And like we had mentioned, they literally drove up to Canada to like really limit test it. And that's not something that everybody can do, but I think you want to sort of test to what your extremes could be if you're looking at weather considerations. And I know that the ski mountains in the Pacific Northwest had to do some tinkering with the blending that they had initially. So, there's some maybe back and forth and some testing that you'd want to do. I think Massport's pilot wasn't, that big in the grand scheme of things. I think they did a total of like 20,000 gallons over a couple vehicles doing that limit testing. And then as you saw, they went all in on like 1.2 million gallons. So they were really confident with the performance and what they were seeing in the variety of vehicles that they had tested it in.
I mean, I think bottom line is, if you're going to do a pilot, commit, right? Whether it's one, two, three, five vehicles, whatever you can, and do it for a duration of time that you can evaluate um, the metrics that are important to you. So, most of us have similar-ish sustainability goals. So if you're looking at emissions, how are you evaluating your emissions before and after? Um, how are you evaluating, as I said, earlier, looking at your maintenance before and during the pilot, and performance, efficacy of fuel, all those pieces.
Uh, Tanya, I would mention that you could just talk with Steve and the city could just be doing what the ski hill is doing. I mean, it's going to be warmer in the town of Jackson than it is on the ski hill. And if Steve's doing R20, the city could do it and it could be delivered at the same time. And um, it really does depend, though, on where the fuel is coming from. Neste's product is great, really low temperatures, whereas some of the product we had out of Marathon a couple years ago was not good for cold weather. It would gel at like 40. And um, those things change, and Montana Renewables has a really good winter product as well. So you really have to find out where the fuel is coming from and trust your fuel supplier to be on the lookout for that. If you are not, I think Steve's a little more hands-on and he can anticipate you have a cold week coming ahead. So let's think about what we're going to order next time and be aware of it a little bit more than you might be with regular fuel. Any other questions? I've been using it personally for 3 years, as long as we could have it here. Whatever blend's available, I'll put it in. I haven't had any issues, but I am a little bit more nerdy than most people are, and I am cautious and very aware of what's happening. And I think a lot of fleet managers don't want one more thing to have to think about, so they might not want to take that on.
Although I will say, when we're having conversations with folks in Maine, a lot of our conversations have been traditionally about electric vehicles. And the public works folks have been much more receptive to having conversations about renewable diesel compared to electric vehicles. That same ASTM spec and being chemically identical petroleum diesel makes them feel a lot more comfortable to explore doing something rather than EVs. And, I think they're feeling pressure from the municipality and the community members because a lot of them have climate action plans or some sort of greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets or some sort of decarbonization goal. And so they recognize they need to do something, but they're a lot more confident in having conversations around this fuel than something that requires them to buy all new vehicles, charging infrastructure, and manage charging time. So it's actually been a great way to engage different folks, at least in New England so far.
And I'll add one more thing that you can always do R5 or R10 and don't even like you don't have to worry at all. Like in fact, I've shown on a few slides that R5 works better than petroleum diesel with winter additive. So per volume of renewable, you're probably paying more, a little bit more because they have to handle it and you're not getting as much. But at 5% or 10%, it's a no-brainer and you're doing something and you can ease it that way too. Oh, it looks like Steve said they're paying $1.50 more per gallon for R99 in Jackson. Whereas I don't think they're using R99 at the ski hill. They're blending it as the weather requires. So that's the other way to get the price down is to increase the petroleum fraction if that's how it goes. Any last questions? All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I think I have somebody lined up from a ski resort can't remember if it was in Colorado. I think it's in Colorado who did just finish their pilot study with Renewable. And I think they're all in and they're going to go over that at the next meeting in February. So join if you want to hear about that and enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for having
Thank,
us.
thank you, everyone.